And this is some more exam fodder. This is a table that's in the Cisco documentation. It basically just breaks down the violation modes and what it's going to do. I've highlighted the ones that are different, so you need to know that shutdown shuts down the port where the other two don't, and that protect does not send an SMP trap or a syslog message. And these asterisks at the bottom, the first one makes sense. Once you stop the behavior that is causing the violation, traffic is once again forwarded. This last one, switch will return an error message if you manually configure an address that would cause a security violation. We'll see that on the CLI, but what this is talking about, this is confusing, is that say I say port F0/1, I configure it for static MAC address of ABC, and then I try and do that same configuration on port 2. It's not going to allow that configuration. It's going to give you an error message. So that's what this is referring to. Port security aging. Now this is probably not going to appear on your CCNA security exam. I'm not 100% sure, but this is one of those more quote-unquote advanced features. We're going to handle some of this today. Some of it's going to be in the advanced lesson. But basically what this is this provides a mechanism to age out secure MAC entries on a port. So again, with port security, each port, each interface is going to keep a little list that says, hey, these are the guys that I'm going to allow to come through here. They're going to be able to send traffic on my port. By default, those entries do not age out. Once assigned to a port, always assigned to a port. Now there's ways to get rid of these, a reload, a shut, no shut. We'll see later there is a clear port security command that can do this, but by default it's not going to age out. So it's not like your CAM table where after X amount of minutes there's no traffic from that MAC address. It's just going to be removed. By default it does not age out. And we saw that with that issue where we had a user on port 1, and port 1 has MAC address X now in its list of secure MAC addresses. This user moves to port 2, which is also running port security, and now it says, hey, I'm on port 2 with MAC address X. The switch says, oh no you don't. I know that MAC address is only supposed to go through on port 1, therefore I'm going to invoke a security violation, which by default is shut down, which can get ugly. That was our surprise behavior, if you will, that we talked about a couple of slides back. So what you can do to get around this is you can set an aging time, and you have two choices for the type of aging time, absolute and inactivity. Absolute means that regardless of whether or not there is traffic being sourced from that MAC address, it's going to time out after a specific amount of time, and the time is in minutes. We'll get to that in a second. So these devices are on a strict timer, so let's say it's every minute that port is going to go in. After each minute it's going to go ahead and clear its table of secure MAC addresses, and then if there's traffic being sent from these MAC addresses still, it's going to relearn those. Inactivity is exactly what it sounds like. Rather than every minute going through and clearing that table, only going to clear entries when they haven't sent traffic for a specific amount of time, let's say in a minute. So let's say you have 3 MAC addresses on port 1, and the first 2 are steady sending traffic, and the third one isn't on the network anymore. It's been disconnected, it's not sending traffic. So after let's say our aging time is 1 minute, after a minute it's just going to delete that single entry for that third one that isn't sending traffic. It's not going to affect the other entries. So depending on how you want to set up your security, you choose between those two types. The default is absolute. Inactivity is probably the better choice, but that's more of a design consideration. So like I said, looking at the defaults, it's not enabled by default. The default is 0 minutes. 0 minutes means that aging is not enabled. The default aging type, once you enable aging, is going to be absolute, and then the default static aging behavior is disabled. This is a special case where you want to clear that secure table per port for static entries as well, which I don't know that makes a lot of sense. It's available if you want to use it. That will be discussed in the advanced lesson. So if it's not the case where you're tying down one single specific MAC or a couple specific MACs to a specific port, you're probably thinking, why wouldn't I use this? This makes a lot of sense. This can become a security issue in the case where you have multiple MAC addresses that you're going to allow on a port. Let's say port Fast Ethernet 0/1, and you say the maximum number of MAC addresses is 3, and I'm going to use the default of dynamic MAC address learning. So what's happening there is the first 3 MAC addresses that come in on that port are going to be allowed. Any subsequent MAC addresses, 4 and beyond, are not going to be allowed. And by default, these entries are not cleared, so in order to get that 4th one on there, you're going to have to go ahead and manually clear one of these other MAC addresses. With port aging, they'll dynamically age out. So say that 2 of those are no longer connected to that port, you've opened up 2 new secure MAC addresses there. You can add 2 more secure MAC addresses. So this is nice, but it could be something that's not in tune with your security policy, because what can happen is if the bad guy knows that you're using dynamic secure MAC address learning and that you have aging enabled, he can just unplug a computer, go ahead and have a cup of coffee for the duration of your aging time limit, and then plug in his computer. And because that secure MAC address has been aged out on that port, now his new MAC address is able to get onto that port. So you have to keep this in mind when you're implementing your security policies. That said, the configuration isn't that difficult. It's basically going in, again, you have to have switch port security enabled, and then if you don't want to use the default of absolute, you can specify inactivity. That's generally what I use. And then you go ahead and set the port security aging time. Big real world and test note here, this value is in minutes. Anytime you're learning a command for a test, you want to know what the time interval is, as well as when you work in the real world. In the real world, just hit the question mark to verify. And I mean, I've been doing this for years. I still do that just to double check to make sure that when I type in 30, I'm not thinking I'm getting a 30-second aging timer, and in actuality it's a half hour. And for exams, this is the type of question that Cisco loves to serve up. I have to apologize, I don't have a slide showing the verification for the port security aging time, but you can see here, I'm just using this example, that by default the aging time is 0 minutes, which means it is disabled. The aging type is absolute by default, which doesn't kick in until you make this something other than 0. And here's that third option that we're not going to go over, but this is the static aging option, and that is disabled by default. So you can see the defaults are listed here, and you should easily be able to determine whether this is turned on or not. And this slide just basically restates what I said before about moving from one secure port to another. Port security aging can help you with that, provided that your users don't move within a minute. That's the lowest setting that you can set it to. And once again, I bring up that there are legitimate reasons for a MAC address to change. The classic example is they get a new computer. So the new PC gets a new MAC address. In this case, setting port security aging actually works in your favor, because it's going to be less work on your part. Because normally, if the addition of a new MAC address or this MAC address is not in the secure MAC address table for that port, you're going to have to go in and manually clear that MAC table, and we'll show you how to do that in a little bit. But with aging, you can go ahead and sometimes get around this because it will age out by the time they plug in their new computer. Again, always weigh usability versus security. From a security standpoint, you don't really want to have an aging enabled. But from a usability, you probably do. Okay, I warned you this lesson was going to be long. We're halfway there, and I think we can fly through a lot of the remaining slides. This slide basically just gives you a table with the default settings as far as port security goes. By default, it's not enabled. That makes sense. The maximum number of MAC addresses is set to 1, and we've talked about that multiple times. Violation mode, as I told you, is shut down. Sticky learning is not enabled. You have to specifically enable that. And then port security aging is not enabled. When you do enable it, the default type for this is going to be absolute, and we just saw that in the last couple of slides. But this type of stuff here, really good to know for an exam. Now, I've already shown you quite a few configurations with port security, but I haven't really gone through configuring port security from beginning to end. There are some caveats that you have to be aware of. This page is from the Cisco documentation, and I will touch on these, I believe, in the upcoming slides. This is really good information for the exam. This bit with the voice VLAN I'm going to cover in the advanced lesson. One thing that again, this will be covered in the advanced lesson, but just to know is that if you have the maximum number of MAC addresses set to a number, let's say 2 in this case, and you want to change that to 3 or 4 or anything larger than 2, it's fine. You'll do that. It'll take that. If you have it set to 2, for example, and you want to set it to 1 or anything less than 2, in this case 1 is your only option, that command is going to be rejected, which basically means you need to remove port security from the port and then re-enable it if you want to set that to a lower number. And that could be a gotcha, because it's going to clear out that table on that port that says which MAC addresses are allowed on that port. Also, the switch does not support the port security aging for sticky MAC addresses. That's pretty important to remember if you're going to be using sticky MAC addresses to determine which MAC addresses are allowed on your switch port. So keep that one in mind, especially for the real world. Otherwise, the big thing here is that secure ports cannot be dynamic ports, and that means dynamic trunks or dynamic access. We'll see that in just a little bit here. They cannot be a destination port. They can be a source port for span. That's going to be in the advanced lesson, as well as this. They can't belong to an ether channel port group. So that makes sense. You really don't want to be doing port security on ether channels, and really you don't want to do it on trunks either. So let's move on.